Yes, welcome to LaRouche PAC's Saturday Night Class series. My name's Tony Papert. This is the fourth in a series on LaRouche's economics, featuring Bruce Director and myself, Tony Papert. The Bruce Director is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, who worked closely with him in various scientific projects. And LaRouche often turned to Bruce for topics of scientific education, educating people on scientific basis of our movement, as he'll be doing tonight. I would say that the revolution that occurred in the US Congress during the election of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker a little more than a week ago is having the effect that for the first time in 15 years or more, congressmen will actually be able to effectively represent their constituents. And it begs the question of the need for a courageous, determined, and knowledgeable movement of Americans which can govern the country as citizens through the representatives in Washington. The need for such a movement to be part of a necessary, basic part of a second Donald Trump administration beginning in 2025. So I think those are some of the things we have in mind as Bruce teaches us the principles of LaRouche's economics, by which the policies of this country have got to be run. Bruce gave the title for tonight, Anti-Entropy, the only sustainable path for planet Earth. So with that, perhaps he can begin.
Thank you, Tony. And welcome. So we have a new Congress that might give the opportunity for a shift in policy. This is a quite revolutionary time, so you can't really predict how things are going to develop. And I would highly recommend that as people who are interested in political affairs and developments, it's really, I would highly recommend avoiding trying to prognosticate how things are going to develop. We're inundated with prognosticators, both in the mainstream media, the so-called conservative media, and the so-called alternate media, whatever that is, and the internet and all these various things. And they're largely people prognosticating about events based on superficial examination of the of what's on the surface, but without really much understanding of what is going on, not just behind the scenes, but behind the awareness of even the participants in the unfolding drama. We've stressed a lot in these classes the importance of recognizing that the principle of classical drama, as LaRouche often referred to, as being the necessary to really understanding how events are unfolding. And as every great dramatist knows and taught us, that the actors on the stage and the plot that's developing is being governed by a principle which is not stated in the plot, which is outside of everything. And yet it becomes clear to the audience as the drama unfolds that this principle, which they can't even name themselves, is what's actually guiding things. And I would argue that the principle that's actually guiding things, of which almost no one is aware, is this conflict between entropy and anti-entropy. Now, I've talked about this a lot, and LaRouche talked about this a lot, and it's a general assumption that as promulgated since about the middle of the 19th century, that entropy, that is the tendency of closed systems to go from higher states of organization to lower states of organization, or thermodynamic systems to tend towards equilibrium from disequilibrium. And there are many versions of the explanation of this, but basically a tendency towards equilibrium or no change is a universal characteristic. Now, it's a characteristic that can be observed in closed systems, such as a heat-powered machine, or a diffusion of, for example, sugar from a cube into a cup of coffee or something like that, or an information theory in the form of information systems tending towards increase in noise. And so in dealing with these systems as physicists and engineers, there's a necessity to fight the second law of thermodynamics in that sense. That is, to fight the tendency for disorganization and to maintain, add to the system what's necessary to increase the order and structure of the system. But it would be, in my view, completely wrong, and I think demonstrably so, to assume that based on the physics of closed systems, that this is the way the universe behaves. And this sort of clear paradox really needs to be understood by the American people if we're going to make something good out of the actors who are right now marching around the stage of our country's politics. And I think that's really the conflict. If you take a while to chew on that and think about it, that conflict is not the one everybody's talking about. It's not between left and right. It's not between socialism and free enterprise. It's not between, more energy and less energy or something like that. It's between the belief in the universality of the second law of thermodynamics and the belief and understanding that the universe is fundamentally anti-entropic. Now, LaRouche emphasized this from the standpoint of human economics as the best experimental evidence that shows this. That if you look at the development of mankind, as we understand it, going back to through the written records, and of course, as we go further back, it gets less precise, but nevertheless, they're key indicators that mankind's development is characterized by an increase in man's power in and over nature. But the facility, the characteristic of man, the quality of man that enables that has actually been there all along. And for example, you take the cave paintings in Lascaux or other ancient evidence of ancient art, of ancient man. Toolmaking is often described in this, but I think that doesn't quite grasp the point, which is art is much better because art really is nothing but an expression of human creativity. Now, you can't really say that the creativity that characterized the painters who produced the cave art is somehow less creative than the creative of Albert Einstein or some great scientist who discovers some new principle of planetary motion. It's human creativity as a continuous and constant characteristic of man. So the question is then in our politics and in our economics, how do we organize our society, and how do we organize our economic policies so as to maximize the application of human creativity and maximize the potential for the opportunities for creativity to further develop. And this is why I think this question of sustainability is a very interesting way to pose it, because we bombarded every day with this new word, sustainable. I mean, it used to come from a little bit of the fringe. Now it's applied to everything, you know, in every single ad you get for any stupid product, which you probably don't need. Usually the word sustainable comes in, and everything has to be sustainable. Sustainable energy, sustainable washing machines, sustainable dishwashers, sustainable dog food. I mean, everything has this adjective attached to it. And everybody thinks that if it has the adjective sustainable attached to it, it must be good, even if it's a cheap piece of crap that somebody produced and is selling at too high a price. And it's acceptable because what one thinks about sustainability is that you're trying to create an equilibrium or maintain an equilibrium. And think about it, right? Everything that's promoted under the guise of sustainability actually has the effect of producing less of what is important. Less energy availability, less energy flux density, less availability of healthcare, less lower living standards, shorter life expectancies, lower population. These are all things that are assumed to be good when their effect actually have the effect of reducing man's power in and over nature, and reducing, as the Declaration of Independence would say, and Leibniz would say, the happiness of mankind. Now, when I say that anti-entropy is the only sustainable pathway, that raises a lot of paradoxes. It implies, for example, that in order to sustain anti-entropy, well, there right there is a paradox, right? Are you really sustaining anti-entropy? Or are you simply organizing your economy so as to conform and promote the anti-entropic character of the universe as a whole? So, for example, in economics, it seems to me it poses the question that if you're trying to maintain an anti-entropic characteristic to the economy, it would imply, for example, that you would, at this moment, be maximizing the production and use of fossil fuels, including coal, which are all readily abundant, very available, and quite usable in a quote sustainable way, in order to create the economic conditions for new scientific discoveries and new technologies to come into existence, which you may or may not know about. For example, like fusion, which we have some knowledge of its existence and its characteristics, but we can't master. We don't understand exactly how to master it yet, although we've got a lot of projects working on it, which are quite promising. But also new discoveries, which one doesn't really even know the implications of. For example, when Carl Gauss set forth the basic principles of electromagnetism in the 1820s and 30s, basically working off in large part, the discoveries of Benjamin Franklin and also some contemporaries like Ampere, and so forth. And he and his collaborator Weber produced the first telegraph as a means of communication from one end of town to the other. And they also developed with Weber the principles of electric motors. And yet Gauss believed, and he was one of the greatest physicists and mathematicians around, that this would all amount to nothing, except at best some form of communication, that an electric motor would never be able to really produce enough power greater than that of a mouse. So the implications of these discoveries of electromagnetism and electromotive force obviously far surpassed Gauss's expectations. So he didn't know, and most people in his day didn't understand how electricity would be such a transformative discovery and the application of electricity to the human economy, that you would replace heat powered machines and pulley systems in factories with electric motors, and so on and so forth, which we all know the story of. Most of the technologies we take for granted today, lasers, nuclear energy, all kinds of technologies and ideas, all were developed out of processes that the people who developed it had no idea what these scientific discoveries would produce. So that poses a real paradox for economic thinking, for people who are trying to think, what should America's economic policy be? Because, and this is, I think, why, another reason why there's such a difficulty in getting people to really understand that this is the approach one has to take towards economic policy. Because it's very easy to think about how do you strive for equilibrium. If you brainwash to think that the second law of thermodynamics is a universal law, you think that the universe is always tending towards equilibrium. And therefore, one's economic policy merely has to look for ways to go with the flow. So we look for ways to so-called sustainability to get closer and closer to thermodynamic equilibrium or economic equilibrium. And there's a certain seductiveness towards that because people think in a very lazy way. But in effect, the idea, in effect, going towards equilibrium has the net effect of making it impossible to maintain that equilibrium without causing real damage to mankind. Reduction, you see a demographic crisis. You can't maintain a growth in population. Now, of course, there are those who advocate that we have no growth in population. You can't maintain a collapse of you can't maintain an increase in the living standards. Remember Barack Obama's famous statement when he went to South Africa, and he said, if everybody in Africa had air conditioning like we have in the United States and Europe, the planet would burn up. So to maintain equilibrium, what are you doing? Saying that most of the world's population in Africa and in the hotter regions of the world should never have air conditioning. So this is the conflict here. The conflict is when you try and impose the second law of thermodynamics on the economy, you end up forcing a collapse of the living standards and economic conditions of the world's population. So this requires that we think about this, how we understand anti-entropy and how we push our political leaders to support the kinds of economic policies which will correspond to LaRouche's idea of anti-entropy. Now, those are very short opening remarks, and I think if Tony and I can get into a dialogue on this, and we can get in a dialogue with the listeners, we can develop these points in more detail.
I mean, how do you, I mean, one whole area of question is, I mean, you know, it means that the implication of what you're saying is that the needed economic policies for the U.S. are being pushed by virtually nobody in public life, because it really, as you implied, I mean, most of the discussion of economic policy is governed, perhaps not, you know, only by the concept of sustainability as such, but it's governed by the notion of how do we stay where we are, which is more or less the same thing. Like, I mean, I think the Republican caucus, one of the things they're talking about is reducing federal expenditures to a 2022 level. Now, I mean, God knows there are, you know, plenty of useless federal expenditures, but they're just talking about how to stay where we are or get back where we were. And similarly, I mean, the discussion of what the Fed is supposed to do is, you know, the Fed should try to reduce inflation to the good old days of, you know, 4% from 6%. And really, now that I think of it, having heard you, nobody's really talking about where we have to go, which is different from where we are now. Which is, I mean, which is self-contradictory, because, I mean, the implication of what you said is to maintain the current situation is really to deteriorate and decay, if that's what you're trying to do. So, I mean, how do you seek for the real bases of policy when nobody knows what they are, or so few even?
Well, that's a good example of how this pathology works, because people oftentimes have a romantic view of the way things were, and it doesn't mean that things were bad. You know, things are always somewhat bad and somewhat good. It's never, you know, all good or all bad. But people think, well, I remember what it was like, the way things were. And of course, you can obviously say that in 2019, things were on a much different trajectory than they were after COVID struck the United States, you know, after the COVID was not the problem, as we now see retrospectively. The COVID, it was the policies that were implemented, the excuse of COVID that was used to enforce basically zero growth policies, which the oligarchy has been trying to impose all along. And, you know, the effect of that, for example, has been to put our economy in a situation where we can't go back to where it was, because things have shut down. You know, the investment in production of fossil fuels, for example. You can't just say, okay, we're going to go back to 2019 levels of production. because so much has been shut down. And you don't start these things up right away. And most importantly, not just the money, but most importantly, the skilled labor, which has been dispersed and is not necessarily readily available. But that's just sort of an example. Or a better example, I think, or another example is the case of nuclear power. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, when most of the nuclear plants operating in the United States today were conceived of, planned, designed, and constructed. That's a real shocking thing. The most of the nuclear power plants that are operating today were planned, conceived, and constructed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The last nuclear power plants, I think, that were put into full operation in the United States was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and those were just hang-ons because all of them got shut down after 3 Mile Island. Now, back at that time period, I remember having discussions with people in the nuclear industry, and they were saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. Nuclear power is always going to be here because people need it. You're going to freeze in the dark if you don't have nuclear power." And yet, so we've shut those things down. Now, we want to have a nuclear renaissance. All of a sudden, people are waking up to the benefits of nuclear power, fission power, because they say it's clean and sustainable. But the capability to produce what it takes to maintain nuclear power, such as, and not the physical plant and equipment, containers, even valves, piping, all the complicated pieces that fit together to produce a nuclear power plant, and more importantly, the skilled labor to be able to carry out the construction and maintain the plant, have all dispersed or aren't even there. I mean, we often talk about the average age, I believe, of a machinist in this country is over 50s, in the late 50s, maybe early 60s even. The same thing with skilled farmers. So you can't go back to where we were in a simple sense, because because in order to maintain that level, skill level and productive level, you have to maintain an economy which is organized towards increasing levels of production and skill level, education, and so on and so forth. If you think about it, in a modern economy, the basic level of education that one should have, that we would desire for people entering the workforce, is the level of a graduate engineer, for example. That should be the basic level of a skilled worker. Now, it doesn't mean you get it in engineering schools with all this woke crap that's going on in the universities today and mathematics and so forth. That level of skill can be obtained, you know, in a more targeted and hands-on way. There's no question about that. But nevertheless, you have to, if you were to have maintained our labor force with that level of skill and that level of productive capacity, the ability to shift into even more advanced forms of economy would be there. So by sticking to this idea of sustainability, what are you trying to sustain? You're trying to sustain an economy which doesn't have to educate people, which doesn't have to produce people with skills of and knowledge in science and culture that create a certain higher level of development of mankind. You don't need to maintain healthcare levels at a level that, you know, deal with the health of the population so that their productivity is always available. We have, made a lot of interesting discoveries and progress in medicine and biotechnologies. And yet most of these things are not really widely deployed because of the financialization of healthcare, that the costs are prohibitive. And therefore we don't make new discoveries. So that's the clash that we have. If the Republicans just want to go back to where we were in 2019, they're not going to succeed in anything. You have to initiate a completely new concept of economic power. And that would require making a commitment, a national commitment, to increase, not increase the budget per se, although you definitely want to increase the budget in certain key areas like fusion research and so forth, and promote tax credits and tax incentives for private investment in these areas of technology. But you also have to maintain a commitment that our economy is going to be based on ever increasing investments and development of new technologies and new levels of scientific improvement. And that means you've got to be committed to something that you don't know how it's actually going to develop. Of course, the classic example of this is Kennedy's space program, where we hadn't, I don't think, how many successful rocket launches had the US had before Kennedy announced that we're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within a decade. That was very audacious, right? But that set a whole tone for national policy. So I think that if we're going to actually be successful in making a permanent change in the direction of the US economy, we have to commit ourselves now to the kinds of things LaRouche demanded, which was a shift to a fusion economy, development of fusion, and the development of and the commitment for the rapid spin-off of all the related technologies into the broader economy.
It raises the question also that many of there have been, at least as I see it, there have been critical breakthroughs which have pulled, focused the economy and tended to have an effect of pulling the whole thing upward. And certainly one of them in the relatively recent period was the Apollo moon program, as you said. Now, but what it brings to mind is that it seems that most of these great breakthroughs have occurred at war or warlike conditions. Now, Apollo admittedly was not that, but it was viewed, by Kennedy and others, as certainly initially, as part of the Cold War, and the program was pursued, in military kind of a military fashion. The Soviet space program even more so, which was secret. And similarly, Roosevelt was not, at least as I see it, Roosevelt was not able to overcome the Depression really until we began mobilizing for World War II around 1938. And then the US economy became, the greatest thing the world had ever seen within a few years. So, to me, the prospect of the direction for the US economy now, in part asks the question, can we do in peacetime the kinds of things which previously, for the most part, we had done in wartime, or as in the case of the Kennedy space program, in something like a wartime mobilization, admittedly one for peaceful purposes.
I think that's the real challenge. Now, I don't think it's just the United States in the last 70, 80 years that's been characterized by that. I think if you look at the development of technology throughout human history, military technologies or military requirements have been a major driver of the development of technologies. Many of the peaceful technologies, as you mentioned, that we use today were all developed out of military R&D to a large extent. In that period of the up till the collapse of, from the end of World War II up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even before in World War II, remember we were at war. The United States was at war with a major industrial and technological power in Germany and Japan. These were countries that also were deploying advanced technologies. LaRouche once mentioned to me that the main impediment, one of the main reasons why Germany was defeated was because Hitler was a greenie, and he opposed the development of new of technologies. But so that's really a question. I know that there's a lot of talk about the need to expand military production or military investments. A lot of this talk about the budget. They're saying we're not going to cut the military, we're going to cut social programs, and that's sort of an old conflict which you have in Congress and in public policy. But it would behoove us to maintain investments in military R&D, because that would require spin-off technologies. But the challenge you pose, which is also the challenge that LaRouche posed, is can you organize the economy in such a way that it has the same impetus for development and application of new technologies for peaceful purposes, purely for peaceful purposes, as we do for military requirements. And I think you can, but you have to eliminate the oligarchical control over finances. And you have to, and that implies that why we have to get back to the constitutional idea that the government through the Congress has to control the money and control the financial system, which is why it's so crucial that you nationalize the Fed, create a national bank, and crack down on this financialization. But I think Roosevelt had the same conflict because, you know, all during the Depression, he implemented certain policies like the TVA, the Bonneville Power, which were large-scale projects that created, I mean, you couldn't have developed the atomic bomb, for example, if you,
without the TVA.
Without the TVA and the Bonneville Power, which supplied huge amounts of electricity for the enrichment facilities that were going on at Hanford, Oak Ridge, and also in Kentucky. They didn't know how to enrich uranium, so they tried 3 different approaches all at once, and that required a huge amount of power which had to be available. But he was being fought by Wall Street the entire time, who refused to allow the financing for the further application. I mean, another example is the rural electrification project. But that was not sufficient to really mobilize the economy. Once it became clear that there would have to be a economic mobilization in order to win the war, Wall Street, as LaRouche pointed out, often, you know, basically allowed this to happen and got on Roosevelt's side. And as soon as the war ended, or even before the war ended, as Roosevelt died, Wall Street was already planning and did implement a policy by which they would cut back on the industrial economy, on industrial production. But I think, you know, we can do that. Mankind, we just need some visionary leaders. I think Trump thinks that way. from the statements that he's made and the way he thinks about science and technology. And I think if you had Trump in the White House pushing this, as he did, say, for example, with the Artemis project, it would awaken a similar optimism in other political leaders that you could make a run at what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I agree with what, and I infer from what you say that at least in recent American history, the fact that we have not been enabled, for the most part, to do an in-depth economic, technological, scientific mobilization in peacetime has been due to financiers, and that Roosevelt has been due to the counter pressure from financiers. And that Roosevelt example, it certainly makes the point, as far as I'm concerned, just as you said, that in 1938, when Britain was threatened imminently with conquest, the Wall Street gave the go-ahead for mobilization of American industry, and then come Normandy, and the end of the war was clearly in sight. The Wall Street, pulled the rug out from under his feet, clamped down, threw out his vice presidential choice, substituted Truman, and in place of what Roosevelt had foreseen, that what was the war economy would become a great peacetime engine of high technology progress for the United States and spinning off to the rest of the world, was shut down in favor of a consumer goods economy and retrenchment when the war was won.
Yeah, and that points to another thing which we were talking about earlier, which is that when you have some type of threat like a military threat, it's easy to mobilize people to realize that we have to come up with new technologies, new ideas, new progress. The difficulty is, but there's a paradox with this, which is that retrospectively, you can look back at a scientific discovery and say, oh, well, that makes sense. We do that all the time. We say that this discovery led to this discovery, led to that discovery, led to this discovery, which is really not an accurate portrayal of how human progress occurs, because every discovery is an original discovery and is not logically, does not follow logically from the previous discovery. For example, Planck's discovery of the quantum of action in black body radiation does not follow logically from any discoveries that were made before it. Retrospectively, you can explain it that way, but that doesn't tell you what went on in Planck's mind to make the discovery. And that story is very famous. And further, Einstein's elaboration, his discovery of light quanta, that not just the oscillations within the material were quantized, but that the waves of light, the radiation itself, was quantized. That was, not a logical discovery. It's a very paradoxical discovery. And when you read Einstein's 1905 paper, which he says is a heuristic examination of black body radiation, Einstein, it's very paradoxical. He comes to a conclusion, a definite conclusion, which is, almost like what Cantor described when he discovered the higher transfinite of the levels of higher transfinite. He says, I see it, but I don't believe it. And that see it, but don't believe it is characteristic of every discovery. So retrospectively, you think you can come up with a logical, that it follows logically, but prospectively it doesn't. So how do you commit your life, your resources, your nation's direction to the achievement of something which you don't even know what it's going to be. In Kennedy's example, which is a good example of this, because nobody thought it would be, it was a pure stroke of genius to insist on a moon landing when we had barely flown rockets. But nevertheless, that was still something which it was easy to conceive could be possible. But how do you maintain an economic policy that's committed to creating things which you don't even know they might exist? And this is a psychological question. And that the part of our problem is we've been so, our culture has been so debased. And that's accelerated, of course, over the last 15 years or so. And you could trace the history going back to the Frankfurt School and all this other stuff to mark the progressive debasement of our culture. But that is that the ability to marshal passion, marshal the nation's psychological commitment to progress is really the big obstacle we have. And you need an optimistic leader to be able to do that. In my view, I think Trump fulfills that and has the potential, if we can get him elected again, to lead, to make that contribution to the country. And I think that this current Congress, if it gets a taste of that, can set the thing in motion.
Terrific. Great. We had a caller, person wrote in the Q&A, basically saying that this is his figure. I don't know myself, but he says military production is 30% of GDP. What do you propose we do in place of defense spending? And again,
well, I'm not.
You didn't necessarily propose we do anything in place, but
no. Well, I think we should reorganize the defense budget. We shouldn't be putting money into, crazy things like perpetuating the war in Ukraine, all kinds of, woke indoctrinations, which everybody talks about, or even these sort of Rube Goldberg type of military technologies, military projects, which the military industrial complex likes so much. I'm not an expert on these things, and perhaps something useful can be salvaged out of these, multi-billion-dollar systems that the U.S. keeps producing more and more of, that really don't have much military use. For example, many people who are military experts talk about, that aircraft carriers are completely obsolete in the same way battleships were prior to World War II. That, the military technology exists on the part of anybody who would want to have a military conflict with the United States to sink every U.S. aircraft carrier at the very beginning of the conflict. Submarines, on the other hand, might have, continue to have some military capability, but we pour trillions and billions and billions and billions of dollars into maintaining a military structure that is really obsolete for what kind of military threats the U.S. might be facing. As I say, I'm not a military expert, so I can't really speak in detail about all these things, but I read a lot about it, and I think a lot of the arguments that are made are quite valid. But nevertheless, I think the military, you want to have a military that's committed to defending the sovereignty of the country. And, the first job of the government is to not get into wars. And the war in Ukraine is a good example. There's no reason why the US should be involved in that. And there's no reason why it had to happen in the first place. Had the US put its effort behind the Minsk Accords, and now, both Angela Merkel and who helped negotiate those accords says it was all a bluff. It was all a lie. It was just to buy time to build up the military of Ukraine, which Russia already said was a casus belli for a military conflict. So I think you could do a lot more with a lot less in the military, but I'm not for cutting the military budget just for the purpose of cutting the military spending.
Yeah, I mean, I myself, it seems clear to me that, Russia and China are getting a lot more for the dollar, for the military dollar than we are, a hell of a lot more for the military dollar than we are. And you look at, well, there's numerous ways to, it's hard to disagree with that.
Take the war in Afghanistan. Every veteran of Afghanistan that I've talked to, some of whom are, high-ranking officers, and some of whom are just soldiers, and of course others who you see, competent people on TV say, look what we did. We put all this high-tech U.S. military capability there. We ended up using it to blow up a bunch of mud huts, and we were defeated by people with donkeys and parts to fashion an IED that you can get at a Walmart store. Now, there's obviously a lot more to it than that, but nevertheless, that's a perfect example of, a wrong-headed thinking when it comes to the military. But the most important thing is you have to have a military capable of defending the nation, but you also have to not be involved in policies which provoke conflict when conflict can be avoided by other policies.
I mean, it's also of interest that, Russia and China both surpass us in hypersonics. So, I mean, here they're using a new technology, using new physical principles to surpass us in weapons. Now, we should be, doing the same things, not just in hypersonics, but in general, in applying new physical principles to military use, and therefore enabling their use for the civilian economy, and tremendous benefit for the whole economy from the military budget itself.
Well, that was the principle LaRouche had with the Strategic Defense Initiative. His Strategic Defense Initiative was primarily an economic development program, which had a military benefit. It wasn't a military program which would have an economic benefit. It was a necessary military program because it shifted the military requirements from mutually assured destruction to one of mutually guaranteed defense, which would have lowered the risk of nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as opposed to many of the others at the time who were solely looking at it from the standpoint of military purposes, LaRouche understood it and introduced it as an overall economic program to develop spin-off technologies that would benefit the entire economy. And that's clearly the approach one has to take. But I don't know if we have military thinkers who are thinking that way. Maybe we do, but they're not speaking up right now. And if we can shift the politics in the country, maybe many of them will come forward and start speaking up.
Yeah, very well said.